Hello, and thanks for stopping by for another episode of MFA Writers. I hope you all are staying cool this summer. Here in Kansas City, it's been 100 degrees this week, so we've had plenty of time inside in the air conditioner to work on this new episode with Keith Enterante of San Diego State University. This episode was a listener request from Drew Hawkins, who wanted to know more about the SDSU program. So, Drew, I hope you like it, and for everyone else listening, if there's a program you'd really like to see featured, just let us know and we'll do our best to book an emerging writer from that program. You can find MFA Writers on Instagram and Twitter, as well as mfawriters.com. Feel free to shoot us a direct message on one of those platforms or an email at mfawriterspodcast@gmail.com. We love to hear from listeners. And if you have a minute to rate or review the show, the best place to do that is on Apple Podcasts. Doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing writers. Finally, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today I'm with Keith Enterante. Keith is a writer and recent graduate of the MFA program at San Diego State University, where he spent 3 years drafting his third book, an absurdist fantasy called Fuka Road. The opening chapter received an honorable mention for the AWP Intro Journals Award, and the book will be going on submission to agents later this summer. Today, Keith has brought an excerpt to read from the book. Take it away, Keith.
Gary Mustafa, Allegiance High's despotic high school principal for 36 years and counting, was a 63-year-old looner. But that didn't make him a loner, which too many students would think were they somehow made aware of the self-deflating extent of his devotion to lonerhood, like too many parents and faculty already thought just because he'd never had a wife. Looners, by definition, were never alone, especially in the colorful comfort of their homes, because all looners, assuming they, like Principal Gary Mustafa, were non-paupers, had their balloons. Gary Mustafa nurtured in his home 46,269 balloons, many with their own name. He relished in their omnipresence, without which he wouldn't dare ever sleep. He liked the feel of them, the sheen, the little nipple knots he'd spend all hours of every weekend flicking and tugging had he lacked responsibility beyond the high school. He judged their moods by their separate smells, their health by their helium levels, their personalities by their shapes and sizes, their overall sexual mystique by the varying degrees of color and smoothness to their rubber skins. It'd be difficult for the average human to walk around in his home, physically if not perceptually, but doing so made Mustafa feel how he imagined the average decent deceased person must feel passing heaven's gates. Students claimed he more or less looked like his name, though he hadn't the vaguest notion as to what that meant. Everyone called him Care Bear. Care Bear, it sounded to his ears, which most of the time were totally maxed out with wax. Gary Mustafa believed his undying love for balloons brought them to life, and endangered balloons needed all the love they can get. It killed him he couldn't save them all, that he couldn't raid car dealerships full-time, rescuing at-risk balloons, loving them to life. Society, his real job, restricted him to life in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. These days, Mustafa floated well over half his yearly income to the Pop Shop, an online organization he'd founded in the effort to bolster non-pauper nations' defenses against paupers haunting Zone Red. Make balloons glow again, a slogan Mustafa had shrewdly adopted pre-Civil War II, the year an ex-reality TV star's then-Cavalier campaign managers first manipulated personal user data in a then never-before-seen or understood strategy to seize the Oval Office, was the philosophy by which Mustafa lived, which is why he'd often pose as a pauper on their public forums online, honing in on their location, their obviously sociopathic ruthlessness a universal threat to shiny sheens everywhere. He lost more money than he made selling talcum powder and seal-a-meal bags, restoration tools, to fellow non-paupers through the shop's website. Being at once a reputable high school principal and a sedulous spearhead of an online organization dedicated to the eradication of the pauper threat had become over the years a balancing act of Herculean proportions, hence Mustafa's somewhat inflating awareness of his own slow self-deflation. Take today, for instance. Tonight. Right now. The few family-owned car dealerships remaining in America were houses of abuse where balloons were concerned, and Gary Mustafa had been eyeballing mixed motors and auto parts for weeks. Mustafa suffered the rotten misfortune of having had to grow up with Randy Mick, the dealership's sole proprietor, who'd been Mustafa's bully throughout boyhood, and whose inherently haughty mother fudger of a kid, Billy, a sophomore at Allegiance, rolled by Mustafa's office day after day to bellyache about the anonymous cyber harassment he'd been receiving since the start of last summer. Mustafa knew he should have felt for the kid. 4 months was a long time for a teenager to take virtual shots to the psyche, but he didn't, and there were real reasons for that. Like father, like son, said Gary Mustafa, toggling the knob on his roof prism binocs, bringing Randy Mick's house of abuse into sharper focus. Fudging paupers. Mustafa had parked across the intersection of Castle and Crown, 1 block down from the battered old building of interest. Mick's gas-powered, defunct-looking pickups were haphazardly arranged, hiding the padlocked garage from view. The place looked closer to a junkyard. Mustafa supposed Randy Mick peddled pills to keep it afloat. The security light installed outside Mick's garage kept snapping on and off at random, so Mustafa, clad in black, waited for darkness to settle. Tire towers leaned drunkenly beyond the chain-link perimeter, looming in the musty moonlight like half-toppled parapets. He couldn't pinpoint with any confidence the year moonlight turned musty. Big round balloons rose on strings tied to the backs of truck beds like floating heads. One cluster sagged too much, misshapen and sunbaked. Endangered. Mustafa had conducted enough preliminary research to know Randy Mick was currently doing poker night in the cellar of Sal's pub on the edge of town, puffing on cigars, guzzling booze and booger sugar with his buds, laps adorned with tattooed babes for hire. Mick's motors and auto parts was Mustafa's for the plundering.
Keith, that was great. That was a great reading. Thanks for being here, and thanks for doing that for us.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me.
So before we go any further, I have to know more about this novel, all right? I know you spent the last 3 years drafting it, and soon you'll be sending it out to agents. So give us a synopsis. If an agent were listening, how would you pitch it or describe this thing?
I boil it down to, I've had to boil it down to a really simple sentence. An interdimensional alien comes to America to start the apocalypse. And it's up to a 21-year-old kid with Down syndrome to try and put a stop to it.
All right. Well, there you go. My my next question was going to be, you had told me before that it was an absurdist fantasy novel. So my question was going to be, where does the fantasy come in? And I guess I am still wondering that, because you said interdimensional alien coming. That sounds a bit sci-fi to me, but are there also fantasy elements to this?
Yes. So yeah, I guess sci-fi, absurdist sci-fi can kind of work too. The thing is, how do I put this? So the language of this thing reads more like a literary absurdist fiction, and there's a narrative reason for that, for the language. I can't say it because it's probably the biggest spoiler in the book, but the heightened language is there for a reason, and that's why the book took me so long. I wrote it very slowly to make sure that the language was really elevated. But I do take a lot of tropes from fantasy. For instance, I have the chosen one trope in this book, but I kind of do my own thing with it. And there are the other setting. There's kind of two primary settings. It's America. So in America, there's Northern California. I go to Tennessee for a little bit, Washington, D.C. But the interdimensional aspect has a setting called the Pain Train, which is where my main protagonist, the kid with Down syndrome, gets kidnapped by the alien and taken to this place for various reasons. And that's kind of where that's where a lot of the fantasy stuff comes in. When he's just in a totally alternate world, I take a lot of inspiration from sci-fi and fantasy during those parts.
Cool. And so what made you want to write a protagonist with Down syndrome?
My cousin with Down syndrome, lovely kid. He's around 21, 22 years old. I had written a short story about him before, about this character. And they were 15. He has a twin brother, Trent. So there's two brothers, Trent and Calvin. Calvin is the one who has Down syndrome. And I wrote about these brothers before in a short story that did really well and got published. And basically for this book, I was like, where are those brothers today? Like, what are they doing now that they're 21 and not 15? Because I wrote the story like 6 years ago. And so I was just kind of resuming to see what's going on with them. And then they got pulled into this giant adventure.
Yeah. Is that something that happens often for you? Like you'll write a character or a situation in a short story and then later like expand it into something bigger? I've had this happen for me as well, where like I'll write a short story and there will be a side character in it that I can't stop thinking about after I've finished the story. And then I'll write a story about that character with that character as a narrator. Is this something that's happened before for you, or is this a first time thing?
No, maybe this is the first time, but I definitely planned on doing it intentionally going forward, because the advantage of knowing who these people were going into the novel, like I had written a whole thing. I knew their psychologies down pat. And so that was so helpful going into writing a book and just knowing who these people, I could delve out backstory way more strategically because I wasn't discovering, I already knew, which was a huge help. So I definitely plan on using that going forward. And I have a lot of wild characters from short stories that I just think deserve space in a novel. But yeah, I'm probably only going to use it for maybe side characters going forward.
Well, I said that I didn't see the fantasy elements at first in this excerpt, but I totally see the absurdist elements. So
yes,
I have to know, how does one come up with the idea for lunars and non-poppers and poppers and this whole balloon fetishizing thing?
Yeah, Gary hit me like a semi truck out of nowhere. I'm not gonna lie. I stole it from a really obscure documentary show, but there was a lunar featured on there, and he talked about his love for balloons and how it's just like my family keeps on trying to take me to a psychiatrist, but I'm happy just loving my balloons. Like, just leave me kind of alone, and no one will leave him alone. And I just love to play on words with loner and lunar. So Gary spends a lot of time alone in this book doing things on his own. So yeah, I just took it from that documentary, but where I ended up taking it definitely differs from the documentary. That, like, I made him a high school principal. That's not the case in the documentaries. Like, so that was like a really fun thing, like doing this like double life. Like, he's a principal and one like respected in his community, but then his secret life with his balloons. It's just a lot of fun. And I love that character. And I know that lunars are real. They're out there and they're real people. So just like when you write about anything that isn't you and your experience, I did a lot of research on it, and I wanted to do these people justice. It might appear at first glance like, ooh, this is goofy, and I'm like kind of making fun of them. I'm not. Like, I really gotten to the head of this man and tried to be a lunar and just was trying to do it authentically.
Well, you told me before the interview that Fuka Road combines humor and philosophy in an attempt to illustrate a near-future America that makes you want to laugh, cry, squirm, and do all three at once.
Yes.
Was that your goal from the very beginning? Like, what were you hoping to accomplish when you started writing this story?
Like, yeah, okay, I started writing it not 3 years ago. I started writing it after my first year in the MFA program. The summer going into my second year is when I started writing it. But I'd gotten the idea for it in like 2016, and I thought it was going to be a horror novel, not a comedy. And I just let this thing marinate in my head for a long time, and like I was just gathering data on it and like trying to figure out what the hell this thing was, like who's this alien character. And I thought the alien was going to be like, a Pennywise like kind of horror creature, and I thought I was going to take it in that direction. Then I picked up Broom of the System by David Foster Wallace. And say what you will about David Foster Wallace, I know he's got a lot of controversy surrounding him and some bad things he's done as well. But the writing really, like, not since Stephen King, who was my first favorite author ever, but not since Stephen King had someone's writing really spoke to my like nerve endings and just electrified me. Like I read that book so quickly and I ended up rereading it, and then I went and read Infinite Jest. And when my experience reading Infinite Jest was like, I couldn't write during that month that it took to knock out the book. I did zero writing, nothing. I had like writer's block because I was stymied by this man's ability to control language. And I was just like kind of like getting down on myself, like I'll never be able to do anything like this in terms of language. And it was freaking me out. But I wanted to, and I wanted to challenge myself. So when I hit Broom of the System was when I was like, what if I combined this kind of David Foster Wallace absurdist energy with a Stephen King plot? And that's what Fuka Road is to me. That's what got me excited to go in and write. I was like, how could I write something like funny in the language? There's inherent jokes, but the plot is like a Stephen King creepy scenario.
So you say that you started off like imagining it to be more of a horror story, and then it went into a more humorous direction. Is humor something that often shows up in your work, or is that something that's new for this project where you were like really trying to develop that in this piece?
So no, for so many years, I was trying to be the next Stephen King. I was writing horror novels, writing horror stories, and kind of getting out my own traumas and like going through all the necessary rigmarole of, being a writer for a long time. So I wrote like one short story before Fuka Road called Of Meth and Magic. And that was about a magician who puts on this persona as a magician to rob bars and cruises and stuff. So like while he puts on a magic show, he robs the place. And that was the first time that like humor started cropping up in my writing. And people were saying it's really funny, even though it didn't, like I wasn't trying to be. And then I was like, let's try leaning into this a little bit more. And now going forward, I found I had so much more fun doing this than anything else.
You told me before the interview that you have a passion for all things reading and writing, and that's been burning for 18 years. So what lit that fire? What was your early reading and writing life like?
Yeah, so I was 10 years old, and my dad got sick with leukemia. And there was no one really at the house to kind of watch me after school and stuff. So every day after school, I would get driven to City of Hope Hospital, and I would spend my afternoons in City of Hope. And there was no tablets, there was no iPhones at the time, there was no technology to entertain you. So one day a nurse just came by with a stack of paper and a bunch of crayons and handed it to me and was just like, entertain yourself, like,
right.
And so I was like in a waiting room, and I started just kind of doing like comics, mainly pictures, and then I started adding words to them, and then all of a sudden I was writing stories. And then I didn't really like reading all that much until 2 years after that, and then my dad ended up passing away. So like this stuff got like cemented into it through my trauma. Like, you grab onto something that keeps you afloat in a really dark time in your life, and it just kind of stuck. But then 2 years after that, when I'm like a depressed, 12-year-old, I picked up Redwall by Brian Jakes. And I was a jock and I played sports, and I didn't want people reading wasn't cool. But then when I read Redwall, I was like, wait a second, there's something to this reading thing.
Yeah.
And I just ended up crushing like all the Redwall books, which took me into Watership Down. And then by 8th grade, I was reading It by Stephen King. And I just started reading and being crazy. And then people said my writing was good. Like all my teachers were always like, you should be a writer one day. You should be a writer. So it just kept on being reiterated. And then when I was 17, I took psychedelic mushrooms for the first time out in the desert with my friends. And I was in the middle of Palm Desert, like in a valley, alone, walking alone in like a field of like lilies. And basically when I was peaking, the mushrooms like kind of spoke to me, and like, I think it was my dad. Like I got like a lot of energy from my dad, and basically the energy that spoke was like, if you want to be a writer, you got to start writing. And so that was like, and it was like this big moment. I was like crying, and then I got home that weekend and started my first book, which took 5 years to finish the first book. But it's like 5 different writers wrote that book, because you could see me improving as it gets to the end, and it's like this big mess, but it was 100% necessary to go through that journey and to finish something. I can't stress the importance of finishing projects.
I couldn't agree more. And that's a lovely anecdote and a really powerful moment, I'm sure, and a powerful realization that it sounds simple. If you want to be a writer, you have to write. I had that exact same realization in my journey too, not as cool as yours in the desert on shrooms, but mine was just kind of in my bedroom like, oh, if I want to do this thing, I have to actually do the thing, right?
Yes.
I have to do it consistently, and I have to start and finish projects, right? So for me, that meant putting away all these failed novels that I was tinkering with and just writing short stories where I could start and finish something, start and finish something, start and finish something. And I completely agree. I can't stress that enough myself. Starting and finishing something is important. Just starting and then giving up halfway and starting something new, you're not working all the skills, right?
That was one of the things that was so frustrating about that first book, was that when I would take breaks to write short stories for, like, say, my fiction class, I didn't want to show anyone that book because it was so personal. It was so obviously me. Like, it's such a self-insert protagonist.
Yeah.
So I was like, I'm not going to let anyone touch this, or else my feelings are going to get hurt. But it was frustrating because I would write these short stories when I wasn't working on the book, and I'd be like, the quality of these are so much better than anything I'm doing in this book. And like you said, the finishing of short stories, like it started with like a 5-page short story. Then I was like, can I push this to 8? Like, and then the next story, can I push this to 12? And then 25, and then all of a sudden I'm writing 50, 60-page novellas, and then it led into the novel.
I love that advice too, of like starting small and like working your way up, like starting a short story that's 5 pages, starting it, finishing it, then moving to a bigger short story and working your way up. I always, I grew up playing sports as well. So I always tell people, like, if you wanted to learn how to play basketball, you don't start shooting 3-pointers, right? Like, you got to learn how to like make a layup first. So, starting and finishing a flash piece, and then starting and finishing a short story, and then starting and finishing a novella before working your way up to a novel, I think is good advice. I mean, obviously there's no correct way to do this. Everyone has their own like journey and process, but like in my experience, that can be really helpful for beginning writers.
100%. I can't stress it enough. And that's the hardest part.
I have to go back to this. You mentioned Stephen King, you mentioned David Foster Wallace as influences. Those are very different writers. So like, what would you say it is that you've taken away from reading these authors that you've applied to your own writing?
Oh man. Oh boy. Stephen King really grabs his reader by the throat early on. And you're just like, once he sets up a premise, you're in it. And his ability to do that for every single book, even his terrible books, he'll still grab you at the beginning so quickly, and he can draw up a character super quickly as well. I just liked his style. It just spoke to me as like a high school kid. Like it spoke to my nerve endings. Like, and Dave Foster Wallace, all I could say, it's so different, but my body and mind were craving something different. And when I started reading his words, it did that same tingling feeling of like, wow, this is something, there's something here that I want to learn from.
One thing I find really interesting about reading is how different a book or a story can hit you depending on the moment you're in your life, right? The age you are. Like, you can read something when you're 30 and think, I don't care for it, but then read it when you're 40 and think, oh my gosh, this is the best thing I've ever read, right?
Right. When I read It for the first time when I was 13, it took a long time because that book's like over 1,000 pages, and it was hard. It was a little bit more difficult, a little bit beyond my reading level, but I got through it and I was like, pretty good book. Then I reread it when I was 23, and I was like, I'm going to read this book once every 10 years, because that book thematically has so much to do with the passage of time and growing up, because it keeps flashing back and forth between this cast of characters who are kids and then when they're adults, and it bridges it at the end. And it's just reading it as an older, like 10 years beyond when I first read it, got exactly that feeling you were alluding to. Like, wow, the timing was just so much better.
Well, it's interesting to me because I would describe Stephen King as a genre writer with literary elements, and I would describe David Foster Wallace as a literary writer with genre elements. I took a workshop this past semester in which we were reading work by literary writers who use genre elements in their writing, people like Carmen Maria Machado and Kevin Wilson. And we seem to be in like a literary moment in which those lines are being blurred a bit. So do you think about your writing in those terms as genre or literary?
I mean, this is the ongoing. This question gets. I suspect it is in MFA programs across the country. This comes up at least once, right? But to me, it's just a marketing thing. In the end, like it's just like, okay, that's what the publishers do to help. I mean, try to get your book into the right hands. So I don't know what I was looking at the language. I was just kind of like in my moment and in my zone and trying to just carry out the story. And because I had that heightened language, I recognized that the heightened language was a thing. And I was like, I'm going to have to go back and really revise this and simplify it, which I did. It used to even be even more complex than it currently is. But it was at the 68,000 word mark where I was sitting in bed at night and I just shot up, and I realized that there was a narrative reason for why the language was the way it was. Like it literally configures into the plot. So then I was like, that's why I've been doing this. That's why I've been writing this way. Because I'd never written like this before. The book ended up being 143,000 words. But it wasn't until 68. That was when I was like, oh, and then from that point on, I had so much control. Then the task became going back and revising those first 68,000 words.
Well, one of the influences you mentioned, Stephen King has written something like 1 million books and stories that have been adapted for the screen. But you told me your book was written solely for the page and that you pity the person who tries to adapt it. I hear a lot these days about how writers are already thinking about the adaptability of their stories when they're writing them. So what made you go this other route?
The fact that the world was crumbling around us, and like, and that was I told you about the character Don Philly, right? Who's trying to write the next great American novel. The whole joke to his character is that he never writes a single word. But the inspiration behind his character was like, how does one freaking write a book right now with the world being what it is? Like, how do you even do that? Like, it felt like there's so much more important things going on than my book. So how the hell am I going to finish this? That question is what informed that entire character. So for your question, I was like, so I challenged myself, and this was early on in chapter 1. I was like, the world is dying. Everything's falling apart. Keith, I think you need to write the book that you were planning on writing when you were like a seasoned writer in your 50s or 60s, because you may not get that chance. Like, this world may not be here when you're 50 or 60 years old. So write the thing that you were kind of meant to write. And now I wrote Fuka Road, which is the first book in a trilogy of this world. It's not going to have the same characters or anything, but I'm going to keep this world because, like I said, it feels like the thing that I was supposed to write and the thing I've been working toward my entire life.
Wow. Well, that's great. And I love that it sounds like you've gotten some good mentorship in your MFA program. So let's talk about the MFA program a bit. The MFA in Creative Writing at San Diego State University. It's a 3-year residency program located in the heart of San Diego. The program was one of the first in California and offers tracks in fiction and poetry. If you had to choose one thing about San Diego State that you think makes it unique or interesting as an MFA program, what would it be?
The warmth of the program. All these people and these professors have been there for so long. like all the people that you learn from, they've been there for like 30 years and they still have this like hardcore passion for what they're doing and for this program. And so it kind of sets the tone that permeates throughout the program. And from what I understand, some MFA programs get like really competitive. My particular cohort just had this authentic sense of like, I want to help each other. I want to help you get this story where it wants to go. So like just the goodwill, I would say the warmth and the goodwill of the people around you.
And it's so important, right? It really can completely change your experience in one of these programs, whether you have like that warm, supportive community or if you don't. So I love that you had that. And, you know, I was poking around on the website before the interview, just to try to get a sense of what's going on at San Diego State. And one thing that I saw was the program touts its quote unquote global outreach. The site says that many faculty members are interested in international literature and literary translation, and that many internationally acclaimed authors from around the world visit each year. I was wondering if you could talk about this a bit. Is this something you saw in your time there?
I did an internship for Fiction International, which is run by Harold Jaffe. And that man is like the definition of a intellectual. And having conversations with him in his office is just, it's a wild experience and a lovely one. But yeah, he runs this Fiction International magazine. And so I read a bunch of stories from people and helped try to do what I could to help select and push them through. The Living Writers program is also really big for this. And I would go to that every Wednesday prior to COVID. I didn't really attend every Zoom meeting, but I did try to go to every single Living Writers thing to hear people talk. And we had Ilya Kaminsky. Oh man, listening to him read his poetry was one of the most beautiful experiences. But his writing, he took 10 years to write this little poetry book that's like 80 pages. It's very short, but every word is like obsessively placed and it really comes through. It's like one of the most powerful books. His book, Deaf Republic.
Well, tell me a bit more about Fiction International. Is there a focus on publishing stories from outside the U.S. or is it a mix?
Yeah, so it is a mix, I believe. I believe they do take stories from the U.S. as well, but it is supposed to be like Hal will pick a theme for all these writers from around the world to submit to. And I think this, as far as I know, he's published some pretty amazing writers throughout the years. I think he even said David Foster Wallace was one of those writers who he's published before.
And then tell us about the Living Writers series. What is that exactly?
So yeah, the Living Writers series is run by Megan Marshall, who is a professor and a MFA ex-graduate. She graduated through the program, and that's what I love too. I love seeing that there's like 3 professors in the program who graduated from the program about 10 years ago, and she's lovely and talented. And I took her class called Living Writers, which is every week she chooses a book that you have to read for the class, and then we discuss it, and then that writer visits San Diego State and they read from them work. But yeah, that it's like such an unbelievable experience to see these, to meet the person who created the art that you just consumed that week. It's like such a unique thing and such a cool thing. It's lovely.
That sounds amazing. I mean, there's a lot of programs that will bring in writers once or twice a semester to give a reading, but you're saying they're bringing in a writer each week that you get to read their work and then hear them talk about their work and ask them questions about it?
Right. So maybe it's once every other week or something like that. But yeah, like there's the class you'll get through like 8 or 9.
Wow.
I seem to remember 8 or 9 writers per semester who come and you get to do a Q&A. The Q&A is cool because like the reading takes place in like this big auditorium that a bunch of people come to and just listen to the reading. But then the Q&A is just for the Living Writers class, and you walk to a classroom and you get to ask these really intimate questions, and they usually involve things that came up in debate during the class. And so like whenever we wanted something resolved or something, we would finally ask the writer themselves, and which was a really cool kind of experience.
Yeah, to say the least. I think that's one of the coolest classes I've heard of so far in all of my interviews. That sounds amazing. And just going back to the international aspect of the program, I did see on the website that the program has special ties to writers in Ireland, and many students have studied in Ireland during the summer in the past. And apparently dozens of students have received Fulbright fellowships to work abroad. Do you know any students who have had the chance to go abroad while in the program?
I don't, because COVID hit.
Right.
So I suspect that there were a few when in my first year. This is the area I know the least about, unfortunately. What I do know about SDSU is that they celebrate diversity a lot. And this place taught me, because I'd primarily come in, admittedly, I'd come into SDSU having only read books by white men, like Stephen King. But when I came into SDSU, I really learned the importance of diversity in literature and just the way to approach things in your writing in a tasteful, authentic, do that thing justice kind of way. Because I had these people in my class, was like a beautiful assortment of people from all different walks of life and backgrounds and cultures. And that was awesome for me to be a part of that. So I know that this program champions that, but I was just grateful for the opportunity.
One question that I hear a lot is there space for genre writers in these programs? And we've talked a bit about the genre elements in your own writing. So I'm curious to hear what it was like writing an absurdist fantasy novel in the San Diego State program.
So San Diego State is one of the lovely things about it. Another lovely thing about it is that the professors are very open to all kinds of writing, all types. They're just there to help you take that story and take it to the next level, no matter what genre you're writing in. So I had people in my program who strictly wrote fantasy stories, which was totally A-okay. And I loved reading genre. It was just a pleasure to be a part of this acceptance of no matter what you do, there's a space for it at SDSU. And they're going to give you equal attention and equal care to every story. I worked with a writer. I mean, my first class ever at SDSU was taught by April Wilder. And she's a writer of absurdist fiction. And she was huge for Fuka Road. She was my favorite. She ended up being my favorite professor. I took her every chance I could. She was absolutely hilarious and so supportive. The most support I've ever received from a professor in my life ever. And I remember when I had written that first page and a half of Fuka Road, thinking it was going to be a horror novel. And I went into her office to just kind of discuss this idea and these characters I had juggling in my mind for 3 years. And 20 minutes later, I basically walked out with the plot of the book. I credit a lot of the beginning and the inspiration and the excitement and the enthusiasm I had for the project is because of April. And then my ability to see it through and get to the end was because of Stephen Paul Martin, who was my advisor, who worked with me directly and read the whole book twice. And I don't know how he does it, because he's teaching his own classes. He's working on so many people's manuscripts, and I'm throwing him dense passages of huge, there's one point in the book where it's just a block of text for 6 pages, no paragraph breaks. And I just imagine him getting this email of my text, after he's so exhausted working on everyone's thing. And then he says, go to open Fuka Road, oh my God. But the attention to detail that he ended up providing, I can't thank him enough, and I can't thank April Wilder enough. So many people have worked on it and given me so many great ideas, and I can't possibly take credit for all of it.
Before we wrap up, I want to talk a bit about San Diego and what it's like living there. And so I figured we'd start with funding, which I think is an important thing to talk about, because I imagine San Diego isn't the most inexpensive place to live. So just judging by what I could see from the website, it doesn't seem like funding is guaranteed in the program, but there does seem to be some funding available. Like you said, you worked as an editorial assistant with Fiction International. Do you know much about the teaching opportunities or editorial opportunities that are available to students?
Yeah, so I get emails every week, here's an opportunity, here's an opportunity, here's an opportunity. They offer opportunities. I personally worked at the writing center for all 3 years. And I ended up working with like over 3,000 clients on their papers and stuff. Then I taught a summer school class to intro to rhetoric, which was great. And there's usually a bunch of opportunities open for teaching rhetoric. Like if you apply for teaching a rhetoric job, you're probably going to get it. The coveted position is the creative writing job. And they only give it to third years. And I think they only give it to third years who apply every single year for that job. So like you get denied. And then hopefully when you're in your third year, you'll be able to teach it. So I was lucky enough to get selected to teach the creative writing job in my last year. And that was just an amazing experience. I miss all my students so much. I got so much love from those kids who just said like, this year has been so miserable, but your class kept me so engaged. And that's usually creative writing, right? Like anytime especially when it gets real dark, when things get real bleak, there's so much time for self-reflection and there's probably an appetite for getting something down on paper. And I was seeing that a lot, as hard as it was, but I think they felt supported and it was an amazing experience. Didn't get paid much for it though.
Well, I was going to ask that. How does the pay work? About how much are you getting paid for these opportunities, and do they provide any kind of tuition remission, or is it just like a stipend?
I got paid like $12 an hour, and technically it was like 8 hours a week, but you spend more time than 8 hours. And if I wanted, I could have like called and made sure I got paid for any overtime. But like I said, there's so many opportunities for scholarships at SDSU, and they want to help as much as you can. And like if you have food insecurity too, they have places that you can go at SDSU to line up and get groceries. So they don't forget about you. They do try to help out where they can. San Diego, you're right, kind of an expensive place to live, but the program itself is not the most expensive, I imagine. So yeah, definitely things to consider. And you got to know going into an MFA program that like you're not guaranteed anything afterwards. You know, there's no guarantee that you'll get a professorial job. Like to get a professorial job, you got to publish something. You got to publish a book, right? To even get yourself in the ring with all the people who are applying for the same job. I think the value in MFA programs is really just like, if you have the means and support, or if you want to do it through scholarships, you go to an MFA program to level up as a writer and to do the work to improve. And I found the best way for improving was, first of all, it gives you an audience, right? For the first time in my life, I had an audience, was writing for people, which is huge. The other thing that it does is when you work on a story and provide critiques for someone else, I think the harder you work in trying to help someone else out, that advice you give to them is advice you give to yourself. And the harder you work for someone else, the more value you, the critiquer, are going to get out of it. But I don't think you get an MFA for like a guaranteed future.
Yeah, that's a total misconception, right? That like if you get your MFA, you're going to get a tenure track teaching job. Or if you get your MFA, you're definitely going to get a book deal. It's just not the reality. Before we go, I want to give you the last word. Anything we missed, any advice you have for someone considering San Diego as a destination for their MFA program?
I guess it bears repeating. You get out what you put in, wherever it is you go. And I would say just to bring that goodwill and warmth to wherever it is you decide to go, to create a culture of honesty, but also, that goodwill is such a crucial component to that honesty. You're just genuinely try to help whatever story you're working on, because it's going to help you in the end.
Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This has been a lot of fun.
So much fun. Thank you for having me.